The morning after they buried her mother, Dale Mercer stood in the doorway of the bedroom that had never quite felt like Lena's, watching her pack with the patient cruelty of a man who had already decided how this day would end. Lena Calloway was 17 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and nothing else left in the world that she could point to and call her own. She folded a gray sweatshirt into her backpack with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since the hospital called 6 days ago. Her fingers had gone numb somewhere between the funeral parlor and the cemetery, and they hadn't fully warmed since. Not even here in this house where the radiator worked and the heat came on automatically, and everything was paid for by a man who had married her mother 8 years ago and loved her for maybe 3 of them. Dale let the silence do its work for a full minute before he spoke. "You understand the arrangement," he said. It wasn't a question. Lena zipped the backpack without looking at him. "You've been explaining it since the ambulance left. Your mother's name was on the mortgage with me. Now it isn't." He shifted his weight in the doorway, and the floorboard creaked beneath him the way it always did, a sound Lena had memorized over years of lying awake, listening to his footsteps. "I'm not running a charity." She slung the backpack over one shoulder. It held 4 changes of clothes, a phone with a cracked screen, and $14 in prepaid minutes, a charger that only worked at certain angles, and a zippered pouch containing her birth certificate, her Social Security card, and the folded photograph of her mother from before the diagnosis. The photograph showed a woman laughing at something outside the frame, her head thrown back, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Lena had taken it herself on a Sunday afternoon at a farmer's market 4 years ago. Her mother had been healthy then. The cancer was already growing inside her. They would learn later, quietly and without announcement, the way the worst things always begin. But on that afternoon she had been laughing, and Lena kept the photograph because she needed to remember what that had looked like. "I'll be out by noon," Lena said. Dale nodded. He had expected resistance and was slightly wrong-footed by the absence of it. He stepped aside to let her pass, and she walked out of the bedroom and down the hallway and through the kitchen without looking at anything, because if she looked at anything, she would see her mother in it. The yellow curtains her mother had hung, the ceramic rooster on the windowsill her mother had found at a thrift store and declared was absolutely necessary. The hook by the back door, where her mother's coat still hung. A green wool coat with a broken zipper her mother had meant to fix for 2 years and never got around to. Lena walked past all of it and out the front door and didn't look back. She was 17 years old. She had $43 in a gas station envelope tucked into her sock, and she had a key. Why, the key had come to her 11 days before her mother died, on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when the hospital room smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath the antiseptic that Lena had learned not to think about too carefully. Her mother had been awake for the first time in 2 days, her eyes clearer than they had been in weeks, which the nurses said sometimes happened near the end. A brief rallying, a final gathering of what remained. She had reached under the thin hospital pillow and produced a small envelope that she must have asked a nurse to bring her, or perhaps Dale, or perhaps no one. Perhaps she had been carrying it herself all this time without Lena knowing. The envelope was old, its paper gone soft with age, its flap sealed with tape that had dried and re-dried many times over the years, applied and then reinforced, and then applied again, as though whoever had sealed it had returned to check on it more than once across the decades. "There's something you need to have," her mother said. Her voice was almost gone, a rough whisper that required effort to produce and effort to hear. Something I should have told you about a long time ago. Lena leaned forward in the chair that had become her permanent residence for the past 10 days, her elbows on the edge of the mattress. "Mom, let me finish." Her mother's hand found hers, the grip weaker than Lena remembered it ever being, but still deliberate, still intentional. "My father, your grandfather, he died when I was 19. We weren't close, not really. He was a difficult man, quiet, kept to himself." She paused to gather breath, for the effort of it was visible across her whole face. "But he left me a property in West Virginia, a house and some land on a road called Hollow Creek, in a small town called Dunore." She paused again. "I never went back. After he died, I couldn't. There were too many things between us, things I never resolved, and going back felt like admitting they would never be resolved." She pressed the envelope into Lena's hand. Inside, when Lena opened it carefully, was a single key. Brass, slightly tarnished, with a small paper tag tied to it with a piece of kitchen twine. The tag read, in handwriting Lena didn't recognize, neat and deliberate and unmistakably old. 313 Hollow Creek Road, Dunore, West Virginia. "I've been paying the property taxes all these years," her mother said, "automatically through the bank. I never stopped, and even when money was tight. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I thought someday I'd be ready to go back." She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm not going to be ready." "Mom, it's yours." The grip on Lena's hand tightened by a fraction, one final insistence. "Whatever's there, whatever condition it's in, it's yours. I had a lawyer draw up the paperwork years ago. Everything transfers to you directly. Dale has no claim to it." Her eyes opened, and for a moment, they were the eyes Lena remembered from the farmer's market photograph, direct and certain and fierce, with something that wasn't quite hope, but was immediately adjacent to it. "Don't let him tell you differently." Lena looked at the key for a long moment. It was lighter than the weight of what it represented. Then she folded her hand around it and held on. That had been 11 days ago, and she had not let go of it since. She stood on the sidewalk outside Dale's house with the November wind finding the gaps in her jacket, and tried to calculate what $43 could do for a 17-year-old with no car and no credit card and no one to call. The nearest bus station was 4 miles away. She had looked it up the night before on her cracked phone, lying in the dark of the bedroom that was now officially no longer hers, because she had known this morning was coming, and she believed in being prepared. It was, she had once heard a teacher say, the only form of optimism available to people who had been disappointed enough times to know that preparation and hope are not the same thing. She had also looked up Dunore, West Virginia. Population 841, according to the most recent census, located in Pocahontas County, in the southeastern part of the state, in a region that had once been coal country and was now mostly wilderness and memory. The nearest city of any size was Marlinton, 20 miles north. The Greenbrier River ran through the county. The mountains were old and rounded and covered in dense hardwood forest that turned extraordinary colors in fall and was bare and iron gray in November, which was now. The bus fare from Cincinnati to Marlinton, West Virginia, was $31.50 with a transfer in Charleston. From Marlinton, she would need to find another way to Dunore, which did not appear to be served by any bus line she could locate online. She had $43. She started walking toward the bus station. The man at the counter in Charleston told her the Marlinton connection was delayed by 3 hours due to a mechanical issue, and Lena sat in a plastic chair bolted to a row of other plastic chairs and watched the departure board and ate the granola bar she had taken from Dale's kitchen because she hadn't eaten since the reception after the funeral, where she had stood by the table of casseroles and fruit salads and not been able to make herself pick up a plate. Around her, the bus station moved in its particular rhythm, the arrivals and departures of people carrying lives and luggage, the tired efficiency of transit, the particular loneliness of places designed for passing through. She turned the key over in her palm, feeling its smooth, tarnished metal, the sharp edges of its teeth, seeing the small bow at its head worn smooth in places from handling. Someone had tied the paper tag carefully, a double knot that had held for however many years the key had been waiting in that envelope. The handwriting on the tag was neat and deliberate, the writing of someone who wanted to be understood, who wanted to make sure the message arrived correctly, regardless of how much time it had to travel. 313 Hollow Creek Road, Dunore, West Virginia. Whatever was at that address had been waiting. The question Lena could not yet answer was what it had been waiting for, and whether she would know the answer when she arrived, or whether, as was more likely, the question would simply multiply into more questions, as questions always did when you got close enough to them. Her grandfather's name had been Walter Callaway. She knew almost nothing about him, which had always struck her as strange in a vague, unexamined way. The kind of strangeness you notice but don't pursue, because there are always more immediate things to pursue. Her mother had mentioned him occasionally over the years, brief references that didn't invite follow-up questions. He was gone before I really got to know him. He was a complicated man. He worked with his hands. That was essentially all. No photographs that Lena had ever seen. No stories with characters and plots and resolutions. Just those brief impressions, delivered and then withdrawn, like a door opened a crack and then gently pulled shut. He had died when her mother was 19. He had left her a property. He had been a difficult, private man who worked with his hands. And 40 years later, everything he had left behind was still there, sitting at the end of a road in the West Virginia mountains, the taxes paid, and the door locked, and the key waiting in an envelope that smelled of old paper and something she couldn't name, something that might have been time itself, if time had a smell. The bus reached Marlinton at 20 minutes past 7 in the evening, and Lena stepped off into cold air that was a different quality from Cincinnati cold, thinner and sharper, carrying the smell of wood smoke and pine and something mineral she associated with mountains. The bus station was a single room with a counter and 4 chairs and a vending machine that accepted only quarters. And the woman behind the counter was pulling on her coat to leave when Lena pushed through the door. "Last bus already came and went," the woman said without looking up from her purse. "I know, I was on it." Lena set her backpack on the counter. "I'm trying to get to Dunmore. Is there a cab company or in Marlinton?" The woman looked up, and her expression was not unkind, but it was skeptical. She was in her 60s. With the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and a practical gray braid over one shoulder. "Honey, the nearest rideshare driver is 40 miles away, and he's not coming out here at night. You have family in Dunmore?" "Kind of." Lena paused, unsure how to summarize what she had. "I inherited property there." The woman studied her for a moment, taking in the backpack and the youth of her face, and whatever else her experienced eyes could read. But then she sighed with the particular resignation of someone who has long since given up on the world making sense, but continues to show up for it anyway. "My husband's picking me up in 10 minutes. Dunore's near his route home," I'll ask. The husband was named Roy, and he drove a truck that smelled of motor oil and dog, and had a retriever mix in the back seat, who immediately attempted to sit in Lena's lap. Roy was a quiet man who asked no questions, which Lena appreciated more than she could express, and he navigated the winding mountain road to Dunore with the ease of someone who had driven it 10,000 times, occasionally muttering at deer that appeared in the headlights and then dissolved back into the dark. Dunore appeared without ceremony, like a small cluster of lights that resolved into a gas station and a general store and a diner with a hand-painted sign and a post office barely larger than a garden shed. Roy pulled into the gas station parking lot and asked if she knew where she was going. She showed him the tag on the key. He squinted at it in the overhead light. "Hollow Creek Road." He scratched the back of his neck. "That's about 3 miles down 92, and then left at the white church. There's not much out there. Old farms, mostly. Some been empty for years." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted toward concern in the unhurried way of a man who had seen enough of the world to know when a person was holding together by their last thread. "It's cold tonight. You have somewhere to stay?" Lena thought of the $11.50 remaining in her gas station envelope. "I'll work something out." He pulled out his phone without further discussion, typed something, and made a call. He spoke in the shorthand of people who have known each other long enough that context is unnecessary. A few sentences, a pause, a quiet "thank you." He hung up and drove her to a white farmhouse on the far edge of town, with a porch light burning and a figure visible in the front window. Grace Hensley was a small, precise woman of around 70, with a home that smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and had a cat sleeping on every horizontal surface. She showed Lena to a room with a quilt and a cast-iron radiator and a braided rug, and asked no questions whatsoever, only whether she'd eaten. And when Lena said not since morning, Grace made her a plate of beans and cornbread and set it on the kitchen table with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never in her life required thanks to make kindness feel worthwhile. Lena ate alone in the kitchen, while a cat regarded her from the top of the refrigerator with the detached judgment of its kind. The house settled around her with familiar sounds, wind against the windows, a clock somewhere she couldn't see, the radiator doing its work. For the first time since the hospital room, the trembling in her hands began, gradually, to ease. Before she went to the room Grace had shown her, she noticed a handwritten note on the counter, clearly left before Grace retired. It read, "Coffee in the pot in the morning. Help yourself. Lock the front door on your way out, on the Callaway place. I knew your grandfather some. He was a private man. I hope you find something good there." Lena read it twice. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. She woke in the strange bed before dawn, with that lurching consciousness she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Awareness arriving before the rest of her was ready for it. The knowledge dropping in like a stone. Her mother was gone. She was 17 years old, and alone in a room she had never seen before in a town she had never visited. And in a few hours, she was going to walk 3 miles down a mountain road to look at a property she knew almost nothing about. She dressed, made the bed with the precision she had learned somewhere along the way of making beds in rooms she was borrowing, and went downstairs. Grace had already left. The coffee was in the pot, as promised. Lena poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window in the pre-dawn dark, and for a long, quiet moment, she did not think about anything at all, which was a skill she was still learning and had not yet mastered, but was improving it through necessity. Then she put on her jacket, shouldered her backpack, and stepped out into the cold. She stopped first at the diner on the main road, because she had not eaten enough the night before, and she needed to be steady for whatever the morning held. It was called Patton's, and it was the kind of diner that had been the same diner for 40 years, its booths repaired with electrical tape, its menus laminated to glossy stiffness, its coffee arriving before you asked for it if you looked like you needed it. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s, with the energy of someone who had been up since 4 and had long since made her peace with that. 2 men in work clothes sat at the far end of the counter, cradling their mugs, talking in the low, unhurried manner of people who've been talking to each other the same way for decades. Lena ordered toast and eggs and coffee and paid with the last of her paper money, keeping only the coins. She would need to find some means of income, and soon. That thought was something she placed carefully to the side, the way you placed a bill you couldn't yet pay in a drawer you would open later. She was halfway through the eggs when one of the men at the counter said something to the other that included the words Hollow Creek Road, and she looked up involuntarily. The woman behind the counter had noticed Lena's reaction. "You looking for something on Hollow Creek?" "I have property there," Lena said. "The Callaway place, 313. The diner went quiet in the way small places go quiet, when something has been said that everyone present already knows the shape of. The woman behind the counter, whose name tag said Donna, set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "Walter Callaway's place. He was my grandfather." Donna looked at her for a long moment, an assessment that was not unfriendly, but was thorough. Then she looked at the 2 men at the counter, and something passed between the 3 of them that was not quite a word. The older of the 2 men, heavy-set and gray-whiskered with the red complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors, turned on his stool to face her. "That property been sitting up there empty for 40 years, miss. The house." He shook his head slowly. "I drove past it about 3 years ago, out of curiosity, when the taxes showed back up on the county roll. House looked like it was working on falling down. You're not planning to live there?" "I don't know yet what I'm planning," Lena said honestly. "Smart answer," Donna said, but her tone made it sound less like a compliment than a bracing. The second man, thinner and younger, with a beard going gray at the edges, leaned forward on his elbows. "Walter Callaway was an odd one, I'll tell you that. Kept completely to himself. Worked out of that stone building behind the house. Never let anyone near it. People in town thought he was... Well," he paused, choosing something diplomatic from what was clearly a wider selection. "Strange and reclusive. After he died, everybody assumed the property would get sold off, but it just sat. Taxes got paid from somewhere. Nobody ever went up there." He paused again. "Nobody found anything worth going up there for." Lena looked at him steadily. "I'm going up there this morning." The man spread his hands in a gesture that managed to be both polite and dismissive. "You'll find what you find. Just..." He exchanged another of those small glances with Donna. "Don't get your hopes set too high is all. 40 years is a long time for a property to sit. Whatever was up there, it's had 40 years to go back to the mountain. Donna refilled Lena's coffee without being asked, a kindness that felt like a form of apology for the conversation. You need anything before you head out? It's a cold morning. I'm all right, Lena said. She finished her eggs and left the exact change on the counter to the penny. She walked out of Patton's diner into the November morning with the word strange turning over in her mind and the man's dismissive hands in her memory. Don't get your hopes set too high. She had been told some version of that sentence many times over her 17 years by people who said it with the best of intentions and the worst understanding of what hope actually required. Hope was not a high-set thing. Hope was what you held when there was nothing else to hold. It did not ask permission, and it did not respond to reasonable discouragement. She turned left at the white church and kept walking. The road narrowed within a quarter mile of the church, the pavement ending and giving way to gravel that crunched under her boots in the cold, then to packed dirt that told the story of decades of disuse in its smoothness, the ruts of old tire tracks grown over, the surface gone firm and level as though the road had decided to stop being a road and become simply a path. The trees closed in on both sides, old hardwoods that had lost their leaves and stood bare against the gray sky with a kind of stark, naked dignity. Their bare branches formed a lattice overhead, through which the sky appeared only in pieces, a gray jigsaw assembled from 100 small gaps. Frost lay on the brown grass beside the path and on the curled leaves in the ditches. A crow landed on a branch 20 feet above her head, watched her for a moment with one tilted eye, and lifted off again without sound. She walked for 20 minutes through this quiet, her boots finding the center of the path by instinct, her breath coming in small, visible puffs. She passed no houses. She passed a stone wall running parallel to the path for a stretch, its mortar gone and some of its stones tumbled, the remains of a property boundary from a time when this land had been more actively divided and organized. She passed a rusted gate hanging from one post, its chain gone, the field beyond it gone entirely to young trees, reclaiming what had once been cleared ground. The creak she heard first, a sound she had been catching in fragments since the church, a low, constant murmur that didn't change pitch, the voice of water moving steadily over stone. It ran somewhere to her left, through the trees, invisible but persistent. And there was something in the sound of it that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, simply present, on the way old things were present in old places. Then the mailbox appeared around a long bend. Steel, the original color unidentifiable under decades of rust, leaning at an angle that suggested it had been struck by something at some point in the distant past, and never corrected. The numbers on its side were barely legible. 3, then a gap where the paint had lifted entirely, then 1, then 3. Below the numbers, in faded, stick-on letters that had been replaced at least once over the years. Callaway, her grandfather's name. On a mailbox at the end of a road in the West Virginia mountains, in a county she had never visited, in a state she had driven through only once when she was small. Lena stood at the mailbox for a long moment. The cold air moved through her. The creek murmured behind the trees. Above her, some of the bare branches shifted faintly with no sound at all. Then she turned up the drive. The drive was a quarter-mile through dense, second-growth forest, 2 tire tracks in the dirt, separated by a strip of tall brown grass, the trees pressing close on both sides. She walked through it slowly, her boots soft on the packed earth, her eyes adjusting to the dimness under the canopy. The creek voice grew slightly louder, then faded again, tracking some unseen course through the trees. The forest thinned, the drive curved. The property opened before her. She stopped walking. The farmhouse was small, perhaps 1,000 square feet, she estimated, maybe less. A story and a half with a steep metal roof that had once been red and was now the rust pink of very old blood. The walls were clapboard, some sections still holding paint that might once have been white, others weathered down to bare gray wood that had split and separated through the freeze-thaw cycles of 40 West Virginia winters. The porch ran the full width of the front, its roof intact, its floor visibly rotted in 2 places, its single step broken clean through at the center. One front window was shuttered with plywood. The other had glass, but the glass was clouded with age and something that might have been mold growing on the inside surface of the pane. The yard around the house had been allowed to go to whatever the land naturally wanted to be. In this case, that was tall, brown grass, blackberry cane, wild rose, and the beginnings of what would eventually be young trees if no one cut them back, which no one had. A rusted iron hand pump stood near the corner of the house, its handle frozen in the upright position. What might once have been a kitchen garden was now a rectangle of particularly vigorous grass, its original purpose legible only in the slight difference in soil color, if you knew to look. Lena made herself continue looking without the catastrophizing she had promised herself she would avoid. This was what happened to a house after 40 years without a person in it. Houses required people. Without people, they simply returned, at whatever pace the weather determined, to what they had come from. This was not a verdict. This was physics. She walked across the yard, testing the porch step before committing her weight. It held, though not happily. The porch boards flexed under her but did not give way. The front door was locked. Somehow her key did not fit it, which she had half expected. She had no idea what the key was for, only that it was for something at this address, and there could be any number of locks on 12 acres of mountain property. She walked around the house. The back door wasn't locked. The knob turned freely, and the door opened with the deep groan of a hinge that had been slowly failing for years, and the smell that came out was the smell she had half expected. Old wood and closed air and mouse, and beneath all of it a deeper staleness, the accumulated breath of a sealed place that had been sealed for longer than she had been alive. She moved through the interior room by room, touch on nothing, only looking. The kitchen held a wood-burning cook stove, its surface spotted with rust, but structurally intact. On a dry sink beneath the window, with a pump handle that matched the one outside. Open shelves still holding a few objects, 2 empty canning jars, a tin coffee pot, a cracked ceramic bowl. A calendar on the wall, the paper yellowed and curling at its lower corners, showing the month of September. She had to step closer to read the year. 1983, 40 years ago, the last time anyone had stood in this kitchen and thought about turning the page. The living room held a horsehair sofa with fabric worn through at both arms, a cast-iron wood stove on a brick hearth, built-in bookshelves along one wall still holding books, a braided rug faded past its original colors, a single wooden chair positioned by the window in the way a person positioned a chair when they sat in it regularly and looked out at the same view day after day, season after season, alone. The bedroom was small, a bed frame with a bare mattress that was past any possibility of saving, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a coat hook on the back of the door where a man's coat still hung, so long empty of its owner that it had lost his shape entirely and hung flat and shapeless and gray, like a shed skin. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, looking at that coat. Her grandfather had stood in this room. He had hung that coat on that hook and looked out these windows at the trees and the mountains beyond. He had made coffee in that tin pot and sat in that chair by the window and lived his solitary, private, complicated life in these rooms for years before he died. And nobody had moved anything since. Not in 40 years. The calendar on the kitchen wall still showed September 1983, and because the last person who would have turned the page had never come back to turn it. Lena went back outside into the cold morning air. She stood on the porch with her hands in her pockets and looked at the property, the overgrown yard, the rusted pump, the bare trees at the edges, the mountains rising dark and close behind everything. That was when she saw it. At the back of the lot, set back from the house by roughly 80 yards, and half hidden by the advance of young trees and undergrowth, was another structure. Not a shed and not a barn, though it had elements of both in its footprint. It was a low building constructed of fieldstone, its walls a full foot thick, fitted together with the precision of someone who had taken their time doing that work and understood that taking your time was the only way to do it correctly. The roof was corrugated metal, gray and newer looking than the farmhouse roof, showing none of the rust you would expect from something this old. The walls showed no decay at all, because fieldstone did not decay. Fieldstone simply waited. It had a single door, wooden and set in a fieldstone frame, and the door had a lock. She could see it from where she stood on the porch, even at 80 yards in the flat morning light, the particular gleam of metal that catches the eye the way certain things catch the eye, the way things left intentionally always seem to announce themselves to the person they were left for. She stepped off the porch and crossed the yard toward it. The field between the house and the stone building had been a lawn once, perhaps, or a kitchen garden. The ground underneath the tall grass was flat and relatively even. The young saplings at the edges were birch and poplar, 10 to 15 years old, reclaiming the space with the patient ambition of all growing things. Moss had colonized the north wall of the stone building in a thick, dark band. Lichen, orange and gray, covered the upper courses of the south-facing wall in patterns that could only be achieved over decades. She circled the building slowly, reading it from each side in turn. No windows on the west face. No windows on the east. On the south side, 2 windows, small and set high in the wall. But these windows were different from the farmhouse windows. They were not clouded with age. They were not boarded with plywood. They were covered with heavy metal shutters, the kind designed to be secured from inside, and the shutters were closed and latched. She could see daylight at their edges, thin, precise lines of gray light that told her the shutters fit well and were intact and had been closed deliberately by someone who wanted what was inside kept at a specific temperature, a specific level of darkness. The door was on the north face, and she stood before it now and looked at the lock. It was a padlock, but it was not the kind of padlock you bought at a hardware store for $15 to secure a garden shed. It was heavy and old, its body solid brass gone dark with the particular oxidation of quality metal aging without neglect, not degrading, simply changing color the way all brass eventually changed color if you let it. The shackle was thick. The keyway, centered in the body, was a shape she recognized. She had recognized it the moment her mother pressed the key into her hand in the hospital room. Lena reached into her jacket's inner pocket and produced the key. She stood holding it for a moment, the brass cool in her palm, the paper tag hanging from its twine. Her hand was not entirely steady. She lifted the padlock, turned it so the keyway faced her, and inserted the key. She felt the immediate resistance of a mechanism that had not moved in a very long time. The tolerances narrowed by decades of stillness, the parts holding their position with the stubbornness of things at rest. She applied slow, even pressure, turning the key without forcing it. The way her mother had taught her, you didn't force things that had their own way of moving. You found the way they wanted to go and met them there. Something shifted deep inside the mechanism, a series of small, distinct clicks, the pins aligning in their chambers, the cam turning, the shackle releasing its grip. The padlock opened in her hand. Lena stood holding the open lock and the key and listened to the mountain mourning around her. The creak, the wind, the silence that underlaid both, for a full 30 seconds. Then she reached out, grasped the door handle, and pulled. The smell that came out was not the smell of the farmhouse. It was not the smell of abandonment and damp and time gone sour. It was the smell of oil, a specific, refined oil, the kind used on fine metal, the kind applied by a person who understands that metal maintained properly does not degrade the way metal neglected always does. And beneath that smell, something older and harder to name, a smell she had never encountered in any room she had ever stood in, a smell that would have made a certain kind of person think immediately of museums, of preservation, of things made so well and tended so carefully that they outlasted everything that surrounded them. The interior of the stone building was dark. She reached for her phone, found the flashlight, and turned it on. The beam swept the space. And Lena Calloway, who had grown up in rented apartments and a house that belonged to someone else's name, who had spent the previous night under a stranger's quilt in a town she'd never heard of, who had walked 3 miles down a mountain road on the last of her money and a key that fit a lock that had been waiting 40 years, lost her breath entirely. Every surface in the stone building was covered in clocks, hundreds of them, and every wall on 3 sides lined from floor to ceiling with shelves, and every shelf filled. Tall case clocks standing against the walls, their cases of dark walnut and cherry and figured maple gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam, their pendulum doors still closed, their faces showing hours that had stopped long ago at different times, as though time itself had arrived in this room and settled. Bracket clocks on upper shelves, their brass domes oxidized to a warm brown that caught the light in the way that only old brass caught it, not reflecting, but absorbing and giving back something richer. Mantel clocks in marble and alabaster and dark, polished slate. Carriage clocks, small and precise, their beveled glass panel still clear after all this time, still showing the movements within. Wall clocks in painted wood and gilded wood and plain tin. And along the entire length of the south wall's lowest shelf, velvet cases, rows and rows of them, each one holding a pocket watch, its lid closed, its surface bearing the particular weight of something that had been cared for, by someone who understood what they had. At the center of the building, running its full length, a workbench. On the workbench, the tools of a watchmaker's trade, laid out with the precision of someone who knew exactly where each thing was and expected to need it again. Loops and tweezers and mainspring winders, a lathe small enough to fit on a bench, oils in tiny sealed bottles, still sealed, spare parts in labeled wooden drawers, a magnifying glass on a stand, everything in its place, everything preserved. Her grandfather had built this. He had fitted these stones himself and raised these walls and sealed these windows and hung this door and locked it with the lock that now hung open in her hand. He had built it to last, and then he had filled it with everything he had spent his life collecting and tending and caring for. And then he had locked the door and died. And the building had stood here for 40 years, holding everything exactly as he had left it, patient as stone, patient as the mountains themselves, waiting. On the end of the workbench nearest the door, placed, she understood with absolute certainty to be found first, was an envelope. Not the soft, age-fragile paper of the envelope her mother had given her. This was cream-colored and stiff, sealed with red wax that had held its integrity across 4 decades. On the front, in the same neat, deliberate handwriting as the tag on the key, a single word: Lena. Her name. Her name, in the handwriting of a man she had never met, on an envelope that had been sitting in a locked stone building in the West Virginia mountains for 40 years. Patient as everything else in this room, waiting for her and only her to come and find it. She crossed to the workbench on legs that did not feel entirely reliable and picked up the envelope. It was lighter than it should have been, lighter than the weight of what she already understood it to contain. She turned it over in her hands, and on the back, below the red wax seal, in smaller writing that required her to tilt the flashlight beam to read, "I knew you would come. I built this for you." The letter was 3 pages long, written on the same cream-colored stock as the envelope, in the same neat and deliberate hand that Lena had come to recognize as her grandfather's. The handwriting of someone who had spent his life working at a scale that required precision, whose hands had learned through decades of practice to make no unnecessary movement and waste no available space. The ink had darkened slightly with age, but remained perfectly legible, as though the writer had understood that legibility across time was the minimum requirement of any message worth leaving. It began without preamble, without salutation, as though the writer had already said hello in the only way that mattered, by building this room and leaving the key and waiting. If you are reading this, then you came. I hoped you would come, though I was not certain. I was not certain of many things in my life, and I spent too long pretending otherwise, which is part of what I want to tell you and part of what I owe you, though I am aware that explanations are not the same as remedies, and that apologies carried in envelopes do only partial work at best. My name is Walter Callaway. I was your grandfather. I did not know you. I do not know what year you are reading this, do not know how old you are or what your life has been, or what brought you finally to this road. But I knew you would exist someday, because I knew your mother, my daughter, Eleanor, well enough to know that whatever distance grew between us, she would build a life. She always built things, even as a child. She built carefully, with attention, and she put herself into what she built the way I put myself into this room. I hope her life was good. I hope she is well. I hope, if she is not still here, that her life gave her more than what I gave her, which was not enough. Lena stopped reading. She held the pages against her chest for a moment, breathing through the tightness in her throat that had arrived suddenly and without warning. Her mother's name, Eleanor, written in her grandfather's hand. Eleanor, who had gone by Ellie her whole adult life and never spoken of this man except in the barest and most carefully rationed terms. Eleanor, who had paid 40 years of property taxes on a piece of land she never visited, automatically and without fail, as though she could not bring herself either to reclaim this place or to let it go. Lena unfolded the pages again and kept reading. I will tell you who I was because I think you deserve to know, and because I have no one else to tell. I learned watchmaking from my father, who learned it from his in the way that useful things were once passed between generations before we decided that useful things could be purchased more efficiently than they could be taught. My grandfather had come from Switzerland as a young man and brought his tools and his training with him, and my father carried both forward, and so did I. I had a gift for it. That is not vanity. It is simply accurate, and I have no patience left for false modesty. I could hear a movement the way a doctor hears a heartbeat, could feel in a mechanism's resistance the precise nature of what was wrong with it, could disassemble and reassemble a watch in the dark by memory and touch. I worked for 31 years at Meridian Clock Company in their restoration and fine movement division. It was not a glamorous position, and it was not a well-compensated one, but it was the work I was built for, and I did it as well as it can be done. In 1983, Meridian declared bankruptcy. The company had been struggling for years. The market for fine mechanical clocks had been collapsing since the 1970s, when quartz movements began making precision timekeeping available for the price of a battery, and Meridian had not adapted quickly enough or honestly enough to survive the change. When the bankruptcy was announced, the company's inventory went to auction. Everything in the warehouse and the restoration workshop, every completed piece, every movement awaiting casing, every spare part, every tool. 40 years of accumulated stock, evaluated by auctioneers who understood current prices but not historical significance, saw offered at fractions of what any informed buyer should have paid. I was an informed buyer. I had spent 31 years in that warehouse, and I knew what was in it. I knew which pieces were merely good, and which were exceptional, and which were irreplaceable. I knew which movements bore the marks of makers whose surviving work could now be counted in the dozens worldwide. I knew because I had cared for these pieces, had opened their cases, and studied their mechanisms, and read their provenance documents with the attention that my whole life had trained me to give to such things. I had been, for 31 years, their custodian. I bought everything I could afford. I liquidated my savings, sold this property's timber rights, borrowed against the land itself. I spent everything I had. The other bidders at the auction were dealers who understood some of what they were looking at, but not all of it. And I understood all of it. And so I was able to acquire, at auction prices, set by people who were guessing at value rather than measuring it, a collection that I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life measuring such things, was worth an order of magnitude more than I paid for it. I moved everything here. I built this room for it. I sealed it, and secured it, and maintained it, and I have tended it for the years since, with the same attention I gave to every piece in my professional life. The collection has not diminished. It has, if anything, grown in value as time has passed, and the world has slowly recognized what fine and mechanical horology represents. Not simply timekeeping, but the accumulated ingenuity of human hands across centuries, work that cannot be replicated by machines because it was itself the product of the highest human precision, made at a time when precision had nowhere to hide. I am not going to give you numbers. Numbers from 1983 will mean nothing to whoever reads this in whatever year they read it. What I will tell you is this. Among what I have assembled in that room, you will find work by makers whose names, Tompion, Mudge, Berthoud, Willard, Terry, Howard, are known to every serious collector in the world. You will find pieces that have not been on the market in living memory. You will find things that museum curators would pay considerable sums to examine, and that collectors would pay considerably more to own. I did not build a warehouse. I built an archive, and I built it for you, though I did not know your name. There is one more thing. In the bottom drawer of the workbench, in a folder marked Simply Land, you will find documents pertaining to additional property I acquired over the years. Mineral rights to 214 acres on the eastern ridge, purchased from the coal company when they pulled out in 1979 and thought the land worthless. Timber rights to 60 additional acres. A survey of the water table beneath this property, conducted in 1981 at my request, which showed something the geologist described as significant. I am not a geologist. I do not know what to make of those findings, and by the time you read this, perhaps you will know more than I did. All of it is yours. All of it has been yours since the day you were born, though I did not know which day that would be, or what you would be named, or whether you would find the courage to come when the time came. I was not a good father to Eleanor. That is the plain truth of it, and I have lived with it for the years since she left and stopped returning my letters. I was a man who gave all his best attention to objects and had very little left for the people who needed it. Objects did not require me to change. Objects did not ask me to be something I did not know how to be. I understand now, at the end of my life, that this was a failure of imagination as much as character, that I could not picture what it cost her to grow up with a father whose finest qualities were reserved for things made of brass and glass and oak. I cannot fix that. I can only leave what I have for whoever she made, and trust that it is enough to be useful, and hope that usefulness carries something of the love that I wasn't able to deliver more directly. Take care of what is here. Find people who know its value. Do not let anyone tell you it is worth less than it is. Trust your own judgment over the judgment of people who want to pay you less than it is worth. There will be those people, and they will be persuasive, and they will be wrong. The key was your mother's. I gave it to her when she left. I told her to keep it, that it would matter someday. I do not know whether she kept it herself or passed it along. I only know that if you are reading this, it arrived. I am glad it arrived. Walter Callaway, October 1983. Lena sat on the workbench stool for a long time after she finished reading, the pages folded back into their envelope, the flashlight beam steady against the nearest clock case. The clock it illuminated was a tall one, perhaps 7 feet high, its case of dark figured walnut, with inlaid panels at the hood and base, its face painted white with Roman numerals and a small enamel moon phase disc visible through the arch above the 12. The pendulum behind the glass door was still. The hand showed 10 minutes past 2, a time that had no relationship to the present moment in any way she could determine. But that felt, in the silence of this room, as deliberate as everything else her grandfather had left behind. She put the letter in the zippered pouch inside her backpack, with her birth certificate and social security card, and the photograph of her mother laughing. She stood up, and then she began, slowly and methodically, to look at what was in the room. She moved along the first wall from left to right, not touching anything, only looking. She had no expertise in clocks. She had no expertise in antiques of any kind. What she had was the ability to observe carefully, and the understanding, arrived at through the letter, that careful observation was what this room deserved. What she observed was this. These were not decorative objects. Whatever they had been in the homes and workshops they had come from, whatever aesthetic pleasure they might have provided to the people who had owned them, they were not primarily decorative. They were mechanisms, thinking made physical, problems solved in metal and glass across centuries. She could see the difference between the lesser pieces and the exceptional ones, without being able to fully articulate why she could see it. Or in the same way she had always been able to tell a good drawing from a competent one, without knowing quite enough about drawing to explain her reasoning. Something in the quality of the casework, something in the way the proportions held, something in the weight and presence of certain pieces that declared themselves distinct, even to someone with no vocabulary for the distinction. One piece in particular stopped her entirely. It stood on a shelf at shoulder height in the center of the back wall, a bracket clock, smaller than the tall cases, designed to stand on a shelf or a bracket fixed to a wall. Its case was ebonized wood, not the ornate carving of some of its neighbors, but a different quality entirely, a severity that was its own form of elegance. The brass dial was engraved with a fineness that she had to lean close to appreciate fully. The chapters of the chapter ring, and the spandrels at each corner worked in a way that made the other clock's dials look approximate by comparison. At the base of the dial, in an arc of tiny lettering she had to tilt the flashlight to read, were 2 words. Tho. Tompion. She did not know what that meant. She wrote it on the back of her hand with the pen she kept in her jacket pocket, because her grandfather's letter had given her one piece of actionable advice, and she intended to follow it. Find people who know the value. She would need to know the names before she could find the people. She worked her way through the room over the next 2 hours, writing names on her hand, and then on a folded piece of paper when she ran out of hand. Names from clock faces, from small engraved plaques on movement plates visible through case doors left ajar, from the labels on velvet watch cases along the south wall. Mudge, Berthoud, Willard, Terry, Howard, Leroy, Breguet. That last name she'd heard of, distantly, in some context she couldn't retrieve. She wrote it carefully and circled it. At the far end of the workbench, she found the drawer her grandfather had mentioned in the letter. The bottom one, labeled Land, in the same neat hand. Inside was a manila folder containing documents that she spread across the workbench surface and looked at without fully comprehending. Survey maps, a deed of purchase for mineral rights, dated 1979, signed by a representative of the Pocahontas Coal Corporation and her grandfather. 214 acres on the eastern ridge. Another document, a geological survey from 1981, its language technical and dense, and only partially accessible to a 17-year-old who had not yet taken a geology class. She folded everything back into the folder and placed it carefully in her backpack beside the letter. Then she took out her phone, which had $14 in prepaid minutes remaining, and called Grace Hensley. Grace arrived in 40 minutes in a truck that moved up the drive with the confidence of a vehicle that had navigated worse roads, and she stood in the doorway of the stone building for a very long time without speaking. Lena watched her look. Grace's face was the face of a woman who did not allow herself to be surprised easily, who had built over 7 decades a reliable internal scale for calibrating the gap between expectation and reality. What Lena was watching, she understood, was that scale being slowly overwhelmed. "Well," Grace said finally. She stepped inside and moved along the first wall the way Lena had, unhurried and thorough, her hands clasped behind her back. She stopped at the ebonized bracket clock and leaned close to the dial. "Tho, Tompion," she read aloud, and something changed in her face that Lena could not quite read. "Lord, have mercy." "You know that name," Lena said. "I know enough to know. I don't know enough." Grace straightened and looked at the room as a whole, turning slowly. Walter Callaway. All these years, people thought he was just... She stopped. People had an idea of him that was not generous. He kept to himself, never explained himself, never gave anyone a reason to think better of him than they did. He let people misread him and never corrected them. She was quiet for a moment. Some people do that. Let the misreading stand, because correcting it would cost them something they'd rather keep. He said he wasn't a good father. He probably wasn't. Grace's tone was not unkind. But whatever he was, he built this. And he had the sense to build it right and the patience to let it wait. She looked at Lena. "You need someone who knows what this is. Someone who can tell you what you actually have before anyone else starts telling you what it's worth, which will be a different number." "Do you know anyone like that?" Grace thought for a moment. "I know someone who knows someone, which in a county this size is about as direct as it gets." She pulled out her phone. "His name is Ellis Boone. He's an attorney over in Marlinton, so I've been practicing here for 30 years. He's handled estate work for half the families in the county, and he knows every appraiser and dealer between here and Richmond. He'll know who to call." She paused before dialing. "You have documentation? Proof this is yours?" "My mother had a lawyer draw up the transfer papers years ago. I have her death certificate. I have the property deed." Lena paused. "I have the key." Grace's expression suggested she considered the key supplementary, but she nodded and made the call. Ellis Boone came the following morning, driving a car that was modest and well-maintained, and told you nothing about its owner, except that he had consistent standards, and no need to announce them. He was in his early 60s, slight and unhurried, with the specific quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent decades listening carefully in rooms where people told him things they had never told anyone else. He shook Lena's hand as though she were a full adult, which she appreciated without commenting on it, and he walked through the stone building with his reading glasses on, examining the pieces with the focused interest of someone who was not an expert, but knew how to read the room. "Your mother's documentation is solid," he said, after he had reviewed the folder of paper she had brought from her backpack. He sat at the workbench with the documents spread before him, his glasses still on, the clocks standing all around them in their silent rows. "The transfer is clean. There's no ambiguity about ownership. This property, the house, the building, or the contents, all of it passes directly to you as her sole heir. He paused. Is there anyone who might contest that? My stepfather, Lena said. Dale Mercer. He kicked me out the morning after the funeral, but my mother told me he had no claim. She was correct. Ellis folded his hands on the documents. He was her spouse, not her blood relative, and this property was hers by inheritance before they married. It was never part of their marital estate. He has no legal standing here. He looked at her steadily. Has he contacted you? Not yet, but he will. When he does, you tell me before you say anything to him. He said it without drama, simply as a practical instruction. Do what he will do, if he has any sense and any suspicion that there's something here worth having, is suggest that your mother's estate includes assets that should be subject to marital probate. It is not a frivolous argument in some circumstances, but it is not applicable here. This property was excluded from their marriage by the terms of the original transfer. Your mother was careful. Whichever lawyer she used was careful. We are on solid ground. Lena looked at him. I don't have money to pay you. Ellis Boone removed his glasses, folded them, and placed them in his shirt pocket. I'm aware of that. I took a look at the property records on my way out here this morning. He paused, choosing his words. I've practiced in this county for 31 years, and I've seen a lot of estate work. What I'm looking at in this room is unlike anything I've encountered in this county, or frankly, anywhere. If what I think I might be looking at turns out to be what I think it is. He stopped and gave her a look that was as close to unguarded as she suspected he allowed himself in professional settings. 17-year-old girl, alone, no money, no counsel, sitting on something that other people are going to want very badly once word gets out. That's not a situation I'm willing to walk away from. We'll sort the fees when there's something to sort them from. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. Now, tell me everything your grandfather's letter said. Ellis made 2 phone calls from the drive outside the stone building, while Lena stood nearby in the cold, close enough to hear his side of the conversation without being able to follow most of it. Technical language, names she didn't recognize, references to periods and makers, and conditions she had no vocabulary for. He spoke in the tone of someone who knows enough to be credible and enough to know the limit of his credibility. A useful combination, Lena thought. The kind of combination she was going to need. The first call produced a voicemail. The second produced a conversation that lasted 11 minutes and left Ellis standing very still for a moment after he ended the call, looking at the stone building with an expression Lena couldn't read from where she stood. He walked back to her. I spoke with a colleague in Richmond who deals in American and European horology. That's clocks and watches, the serious end of the market. She's been in the business for 30 years. I described what's here in general terms, the number and variety of the pieces, some of the names on the dials. He paused. She's driving from Richmond tomorrow morning. 6-hour drive. She said she'd leave at 4. People don't drive 6 hours for something that isn't worth it, Lena said. No, Ellis agreed. They don't. He looked at her. In the meantime, I want you to lock that building and not mention to anyone what's inside it. Not the specifics. The men in this county talk, and I'd rather we understand what we have before other people start forming opinions about it. She thought about the men in Patton's diner, the dismissive hands, and the reasonable advice not to get her hopes up. I don't think they'll be forming high opinions, she said. Well, opinions tend to revise quickly when numbers become available, Ellis said. That's the part we need to manage carefully. Dale called that evening. She was at Grace's kitchen table eating a bowl of soup that Grace had set in front of her, with the same wordless efficiency as the beans and cornbread 2 nights before, when her phone buzzed and his name appeared on the cracked screen. She looked at it for 2 full rings before she answered, because she wanted to be certain when she picked it up that she was ready for whatever the next few minutes required. Lena. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had decided in advance to be reasonable, which in Dale's case was always a warning. I've been thinking about your mother's estate. Have you? There may be assets we haven't accounted for, the property she held that could be subject to probate. I've spoken with a lawyer here, and you should speak with Ellis Boone, Lena said. He's in Marlinton. He's representing me. She recited the phone number that Ellis had given her for exactly this situation. A pause, longer than Dale usually allowed himself. You've already retained counsel. The property is mine, she said. My mother made sure of that before she got sick. Mr. Boone has reviewed the documentation and agrees. If you have questions about the estate, you're welcome to have your attorney call his. Another pause. She could hear in it the recalibration happening. The original plan, whatever it had been, being adjusted in real time. There's no need to make this adversarial, he said, switching registers smoothly, to the reasonableness becoming something warmer and more difficult to object to. You're 17 years old, alone out there, no income. Whatever's on that property, you're going to need help managing it. I have resources. I know people. I appreciate that, Lena said. She kept her voice even, because even was what she needed it to be, and she had been practicing evenness for 17 years of living with a man who was very good at turning any crack in composure into leverage. I'll be in touch through Mr. Boone's office. She ended the call. Grace, across the table, said nothing. She simply pushed the soup slightly closer to Lena's side and picked up her own spoon. Lena ate the soup. It was very good soup. Her hands were perfectly steady. The appraiser's name was Catherine Marsh, and she arrived at 10:30 the following morning in a car that was more expensive than it needed to be, and drove it the way someone drove a car they had forgotten was expensive. She was in her late 50s, with short silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the compact, self-contained energy of a person who spent most of her professional life moving through spaces that required her complete attention. She shook Lena's hand, shook Ellis's, looked at the stone building without expression, and asked for the door to be opened. She went inside alone. Lena and Ellis waited in the cold outside. Neither of them spoke much. Ellis checked his phone occasionally. Lena watched the stone building and listened to the creak she could still hear, but still couldn't see. Its voice unchanged and unhurried. Indifferent to whatever was happening inside the room it had been running past for however many decades. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. When Catherine Marsh came out, her expression was controlled in the way that very experienced people controlled their expressions when they needed a moment before they spoke. She stood in the doorway of the stone building and looked at Lena with something in her eyes that took Lena a moment to identify, partly because she hadn't expected it, and partly because it was not the emotion she associated with business transactions. It was something close to reverence. "Your grandfather," Catherine said. "What do you know about him?" He worked for a clockmaking company called Meridian for 31 years. He was a watchmaker by training. When they went bankrupt, and he bought what he could at the liquidation auction. Lena paused. He knew what he was looking at. Catherine nodded slowly. He knew exactly what he was looking at. She stepped back out into the cold and pulled the door closed behind her. I want to be careful about what I say, because a preliminary assessment of a collection this size and complexity requires considerably more work than 45 minutes allows. I will need to bring in colleagues. I will need provenance research on the significant pieces, which will take time. Some of what's in there has not been on the market in decades, possibly longer, and establishing that history accurately is essential before any figure I give you means anything reliable. She paused, and with the careful deliberateness of someone who chose their words, the way her predecessor's profession had chosen their components, one at a time, with attention to fit and function. With that caveat clearly stated, do you want a preliminary impression? Yes, Lena said. There is a bracket clock on the back wall, ebonized case, brass dial, pendulum movement, marked Tho, Tompion, with what appears to be his original signature on the back plate. She paused. Thomas Tompion was England's greatest clockmaker. He worked in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. He made approximately 650 clocks in his lifetime, by best current estimates. The complete ones that still come to market, which happens rarely, sell at major auction for between $400,000 and several $1 million, depending on condition and provenance. The one in that room, if it is what it appears to be, is in exceptional condition. I have never seen a surviving Tompion in better physical state. Neither Lena nor Ellis said anything. There are what appear to be 3 significant French carriage clocks, at least 2 of which may be by Abraham Louis Breguet or his workshop. Breguet is to watchmaking what Tompion is to clockmaking, the standard against which everything else is measured. His work at auction, she stopped. Singular pieces by Breguet have sold for 8 figures, several millions, some considerably more than several. She looked at Lena. There are also approximately 40 pocket watches in the velvet cases along the south wall. I opened 6 of them. 3 are unsigned or by minor makers. 2 are by Leroy et Fils of Paris, which is significant, but not extraordinary. The 6th, she took a breath, the first sign of anything less than complete composure she had shown. The 6th bears the mark of Abraham Louis Breguet, and a serial number that, if it corresponds to what I believe it may correspond to, represents a watch I have read about in the academic literature, but have never personally encountered and did not expect to encounter in my professional lifetime. What does that mean? Lena said. It was not quite a question. It means that one pocket watch, if the provenance research confirms what I believe the serial number indicates, may be worth more than everything else in that room combined. Catherine looked at her steadily. And that room, taken as a whole collection, is among the most significant assemblages of fine mechanical horology I have encountered in 30 years of working in this field. Your grandfather did not build a warehouse. He built something closer to a national treasure in a stone building on a dirt road in West Virginia, and locked the door and waited for someone to come and open it. She looked at Ellis. I want to bring 2 colleagues from my firm. I also want to consult with Christie's European clocks and watches department, and I have a contact at the Smithsonian's clock collection who will want to know about this. None of that consultation obligates you to anything. It simply ensures that when we give you an accurate picture of what you have, it will actually be accurate. She looked back at Lena. That door should remain locked. And these conversations should remain confidential until the full assessment is complete. Can you agree to that? Yes, Lena said. Good. Catherine picked up her bag from the ground where she'd set it. I'll return in 1 week with my colleagues. In the meantime, she hesitated, which Lena was beginning to understand was unusual for her. In the meantime, I want you to know something. I have been in rooms with significant collections many times in my career. Private holdings, museum acquisitions, estate discoveries. I have seen things that were remarkable and things that were exceptional, and occasionally things that were genuinely historic. She looked at the stone building. I've never been in a room that felt as clearly as that one does, as though someone spent his entire life building it as a gift for a specific person. Whatever your grandfather was to your family, whatever the complications of that, and I imagine there were complications, he was not careless with what he put in that room. He was precise and deliberate, and he maintained it across 40 years with the attention of someone who understood exactly what he was protecting and exactly who he was protecting it for. She paused. I thought you might want to know that. She got in her car and drove back down the drive and disappeared through the trees. Ellis and Lena stood in the clearing for a long moment in the silence she left behind. 8 figures, Lena said finally. She said one watch might be worth 8 figures. She was careful to say might, Ellis said, for he was using the tone of a man trying to provide ballast in a conversation that had become rapidly untethered from anything he had professionally prepared for. Provenance research, authentication, all of that, I know, Lena said. But she didn't look like a person who used words carelessly. Ellis was quiet for a moment. No, he agreed. She didn't. Dale arrived in Dunore 4 days later. Lena did not know he was coming until Grace saw his car from the window of the diner, where the two of them had been having lunch, and described it without emphasis, a silver sedan with Ohio plates driving slowly down the main road, in a tone that suggested she had been expecting something like this, and had simply been waiting to see what shape it took. Lena pulled out her phone and called Ellis. Stay where you are, he said, without asking what was happening or why she was calling. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dale found Patton's diner through what must have been simple process of elimination. It was one of 3 businesses on the main road that could tell him anything about a teenager who had arrived in town 6 days ago. He came through the door in his barn jacket, which he wore because he knew it made him look like a reasonable man, rather than the kind of man who checked flight prices to West Virginia the morning after his wife's funeral. Lena had learned to read him in 8 years. She saw the calculation behind the expression immediately. He slid into the booth across from her without being invited and didn't acknowledge Grace, which was his first mistake in a room where Grace had been a fixture for 40 years. Lena. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his voice low, his eyes performing concern. I've been worried about you. 17 years old, alone out here. You weren't worried enough to ask where I was going when you told me to leave, she said. She kept her voice quiet because she had decided on quiet for this conversation. Quiet was harder to dismiss, and harder to interrupt, and harder to use as evidence of instability, which he understood was a move available to him if she gave him the opening for it. That was, I said things I didn't fully mean, in the grief of everything. I want to make that right. I want to help. He paused. and something shifted in his face that might in a different man have been regret, and in Dale was performance of regret, close enough to be useful, but not close enough to cost him anything. See, I've heard there may be assets on this property that we didn't account for in your mother's estate. If there's something of value here, it could be subject to estate proceedings that affect us both. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to suggest we handle this together, as family. We're not family, Lena said. We were never family. You married my mother, and you were civil to me when it cost you nothing, and unkind when it didn't. And you put her clothes in bags before the funeral flowers had finished wilting. And I don't want your help. Dale's expression changed. The performance fell away, and what appeared in its place was the face he wore when he was not trying to be observed. Listen to me very carefully. I don't know exactly what's on that property, but I know the property taxes were being paid by an automated trust, which means there's a legal mechanism attached to that land that your mother was party to. A good lawyer can argue that makes it marital property. My lawyer has already filed a preliminary inquiry with the county court. Ellis Boone will be here in 10 minutes, Lena said. You can explain that to him. Dale sat back. He looked at her across the laminate table with its coffee ring stains and its laminated menus, and he seemed to be reassessing something, recalibrating the version of this situation he had driven 6 hours to resolve in an afternoon. You're 17 years old, he said finally. It came out less like an observation than a threat that hadn't yet decided on its specific form. I know, Lena said. I've been 17 for 11 months. I'm very experienced at it. Donna, behind the counter, made a sound that might have been a laugh suppressed with professional effort. Grace's expression remained composed, but something moved in her eyes that Lena recognized as satisfaction. Ellis arrived 14 minutes after the call, not 20. He had driven faster than his usual pace, which Lena noted and appreciated. He sat beside her in the booth, set his briefcase on the table, and looked at Dale with the specific quality of patience that belonged to men who have spent 3 decades in courtrooms where the loudest person never won. Mr. Mercer, he said pleasantly, I understand you've engaged counsel in Cincinnati regarding the Callaway estate. Have your attorney contact my office. We'll address whatever concerns you have through the appropriate channels. In the meantime, this conversation is over. He opened his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. I'd ask you to read this and have your attorney call me at their earliest convenience. Thank you for making the drive. Dale looked at the paper. He looked at Ellis. He looked at Lena. Whatever he had expected to find in this booth, a frightened teenager who could be managed, an unprotected asset he could attach himself to before anyone else understood its value, was not what was in front of him. And he had been in the world long enough to understand the difference between a battle and a wall. He took the paper. He stood up. He walked out of Patton's diner without another word, and Lena watched through the window as his silver sedan with Ohio plates reversed out of the spot it had parked in and drove back up the main road and out of Dunore. She realized only after the car was gone that she had been holding her breath. Will he keep fighting? She asked Ellis. Probably. He closed his briefcase with a soft click. But the legal position is clear, and if his attorney is competent, they'll tell him so within the week. Fighting clear title on a property that was explicitly excluded from a marital estate is expensive and unlikely to succeed. Eventually, the math of it will be persuasive. He looked at her. You handled that well. I've had practice, she said. It was during the second day of Catherine Marsh's return visit, the full assessment, and this time with 2 colleagues from her firm and a clock specialist from the Smithsonian who had driven from Washington with the barely suppressed urgency of someone who had been told something unbelievable and needed to confirm it with their own eyes. That Lena found the other thing in the stone building that Walter Callaway had not mentioned in his letter. Or rather, she found it because the Smithsonian specialist found it first and called her over in a voice stripped of its previous professional composure. He had been examining the tall case clocks along the left wall, working methodically from left to right with a flashlight and a loupe, making notes in his phone. He had stopped in front of the third clock from the end, a case of cherry wood with a painted arch dial showing a sailing ship moving across a calm sea, and opened the case door to examine the movement, and found, tucked behind the pendulum on a small hook fixed to the back of the case, an envelope. Not the cream-colored stock of her grandfather's letter. A plain white envelope, sealed with ordinary tape, addressed in the same neat hand to a single word. Supplement. Catherine brought it to Lena without opening it. The Smithsonian specialist remained by the clock, looking with undisguised curiosity. Catherine's two colleagues had gone quiet in the way that people went quiet when they understood they were observing something that was not their business to observe. Lena opened it. Inside was one page in her grandfather's hand. It was dated 6 months after the letter in the envelope. April 1984, 6 months before he died. She would learn later. The handwriting was slightly less precise, the pen pressure lighter, the writing of a man whose hands had begun to lose the strength that had made them extraordinary. I have thought more about the geological survey than I allowed myself to in the letter. The geologist's findings were significant enough that I hired a second geologist independently, and his assessment confirmed the first. Beneath the eastern ridge, the acreage for which the mineral rights documents are in the land folder, there are natural gas deposits, whose scale the second geologist described as substantial. In 1984, the technology required to extract them does not yet exist at commercially viable cost. This may change. I suspect it will change. If it does, the mineral rights I have secured represent a separate and considerable asset, independent of the collection in this building. I did not mention this in the letter because I did not want to lead you toward expectation I could not fully support. I mention it now because I believe you will know what to do with the information more wisely than I would in your position, and because the truth of what is here deserves to be stated completely, rather than managed for comfort. Everything I have built here, I built for you. Use it well. Lena folded the page and held it for a moment in the cool air of the stone building, surrounded by the patient clocks and the people who had come from across the country to understand their value. She thought of her grandfather, alone in this room in 1984, while writing a supplement to a letter he had written 6 months earlier, wanting to be honest, wanting to be complete, not wanting to leave anything out that she might need. A man who had given his best attention to objects and had only this much left for people, and was trying, at the end, to give it. She thought of her mother, who had paid 40 years of property taxes on a property she could not bring herself to visit, who had carried a key in an envelope through every apartment, and every difficult year, and every sleepless night, and pressed it into her daughter's hand when there was nothing else left to give. She thought of a 17-year-old girl standing on a sidewalk outside a house that wasn't hers, with $43 and a key and the specific, on stubborn conviction that the world owed nobody anything but that effort and attention and the willingness to walk toward difficult things rather than away from them was still worth trying. Catherine Marsh was watching her from across the room with the careful attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something that required witness. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Lena said. She folded the supplement and put it in her pocket. "What do you need from me this afternoon?" "The pocket watches," Catherine said. "We need to go through every case. All 40. Lena nodded. She crossed to the velvet cases along the south wall and began, methodically, and without hurry, to help open them. The watch was in the 23rd case. Catherine was the one who opened it, lifting the hinged lid of the velvet case with the particular care of someone who had learned through long experience that the gap between careful and careless was measured in damage you could not undo. Inside, on its velvet bed, lay a pocket watch of exceptional beauty, a hunter case in yellow gold, its surface engraved with a pattern of interleaved vines, so fine they were almost invisible until you tilted the case in the light, at which point they seemed to materialize out of the gold itself, as though the metal had grown them rather than being worked. The case was opened with the nail of Catherine's index finger applied to the small release button at the crown, and the lid swung back on a movement that Lena could see even at arm's length was unlike anything she had seen in the other watches that morning. Catherine produced a loop from her jacket pocket and held it to her eye and leaned close and was still. 30 seconds passed. 40. The Smithsonian specialist had come to stand behind Catherine's shoulder. He looked through his own loop, and a sound came from him that was not quite a word, a small exhalation that carried enough information to tell Lena that whatever they were looking at was the thing Catherine had described that first morning, the thing she had read about and not expected to encounter. "Serial number confirms it," the specialist said. He straightened. His voice had the steadiness of a person applying considerable effort to maintain it. "The provenance records at the Breguet Museum list it as sold to the Duc de Bourbon in 1808 and subsequently lost to record after the estate dispersal in 1832. It has been assumed, not lost, but unlocated." He looked at Catherine. "It has been unlocated for 190 years. Catherine set the watch down on its velvet bed with the care she would have given to something that could not be replaced because there was nothing in the world to replace it with. She looked at Lena. She had been carefully controlled through 2 days of professional assessment, and she was controlled now, but only just. "I'm going to need to make some calls," she said. "Before I give you any number, I want you to understand that what I say next is a preliminary estimate, subject to all the caveats about authentication and provenance research that I have already given you. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Lena said. "This watch alone." Catherine stopped. She picked up the velvet case and looked at the watch in it for another moment. "Christie sold a Breguet pocket watch of this period at auction in Geneva 3 years ago for $11 million. It was a fine example, a representative piece. This is not a representative piece." She set the case down. "I do not know the final number. I cannot know the final number until the authentication process is complete and we understand the full provenance. But what I can tell you is that the figure I am holding in my mind right now, for this collection taken in its entirety, the clocks, the watches, the movements, the spare parts, all of it together, is a number with 8 digits before the decimal point. And that number is at the lower end of what I believe the evidence supports." The stone building was very quiet. outside, and the creek ran over its stones with the sound it had been making for centuries before Walter Callaway was born, and would continue making long after everyone in this room was gone. Above the sealed shutters, the November sky had gone the flat white of coming weather. Somewhere in the bare trees, a single bird was calling. 8 digits, Lena said. At the lower end, Catherine said. Yes. Lena looked at the 23 open velvet cases along the south wall, at the 17 still waiting to be opened. She looked at the tall clocks standing in their rows, at the bracket clocks on their shelves, at the carriage clocks and the mantel clocks, and the bare movements mounted on their boards, with their gears still meshed and their escapements still waiting after 40 years. To tick. She thought of a man who had bought all of this at a bankruptcy auction in 1983 because he could see what everyone else was failing to see, who had carried it up a mountain road in West Virginia and built walls around it and sealed the windows and locked the door with a lock that only one key could open, who had addressed the envelope to a name he hadn't known yet and trusted that someday she would come and deserve it and know what to do with it when she arrived. We should open the rest of the cases, Lena said. She picked up the 24th, and she was steady, and she began. Catherine Marsh called on a Thursday morning, at 18 days after the assessment team had driven back down the Hollow Creek Road and left Lena alone in the clearing, with the stone building locked behind her, and the weight of what they had found pressing on the air around her, like a change in weather. Lena was in the farmhouse when the call came, sitting on the floor of the living room beside the cast-iron stove, which she had cleaned and filled and learned to operate through a combination of Grace's instruction and her own stubbornness. A small fire burned inside it. The room smelled of wood smoke and the particular dusty warmth of a cold house beginning, slowly and with great reluctance, to remember what it was for. She answered on the first ring. "The Tompion is confirmed," Catherine said, with the directness of someone who has spent 18 days assembling a conclusion and has no patience left for preamble. We sent photographs and movement documentation to 3 independent Tompion scholars in England. All 3 confirmed it as genuine, provisionally pending physical examination, which I intend to arrange in January. The movement matches his recorded work of the 1690s. The case is original. The signature is his." She paused. "The Breguet is also confirmed. The Musée Breguet in Paris has verified the serial number against their archival records. It is the watch commissioned by the Duc de Bourbon in 1808 and sold at the estate dispersal in 1832 to an unknown American buyer. It has been unlocated for 192 years. Another pause, shorter. "A Swiss collector has already made a private inquiry. I declined to give them a number, but they suggested they would begin at $30 million. Lena was very still beside the stove. "The full collection," Catherine continued, "assessed at current market values, with the Providence research now completed for the 37 most significant pieces and estimated for the remaining inventory, comes to a figure between $94 million and $120 million. That range reflects the difference between what a private sale might achieve and what a properly managed auction campaign, timed correctly and marketed to the right international collectors, could produce over a 2 to 3 year period." She stopped. "I want you to take a moment with that number before I say anything else." Lena looked at the fire through the stove's small glass door. She had built it herself that morning from wood she had split in the yard with an axe she found in the shed, because winter had arrived in the mountains with the serious and unambiguous intent of an old creditor, and the space heaters she had purchased were managing but not sufficient. The fire was modest. It was doing exactly what she had built it to do, neither more nor less. She had been proud of it an hour ago, and the feeling that accompanied that pride was not entirely different from the feeling she was having now, though the scale was so different as to make comparison absurd. "I've taken a moment," she said. "Then we should talk about next steps," Catherine said. "Because what comes next is important, and how you handle it will matter considerably." The news reached Dunore the way all news reached small places, not through any single announcement, but through the gradual accumulation of glances and lowered voices and the particular quality of attention that a town of 800 paid to anything that disrupted its established understanding of itself. Ellis had been as careful as one person could be about confidentiality, but confidentiality in a county where everyone knew everyone's attorney was a relative aspiration rather than an achievable condition. The precise figure did not circulate. What circulated was the outline that the Callaway property on Hollow Creek Road, the abandoned place everyone had driven past for 40 years and assessed and dismissed without further thought, had turned out to contain something significant. That a teenage girl who had arrived in town with a backpack and a key had locked herself in a stone building with specialists from Washington and New York and had not come out for 2 days. That Ellis Boone had been seen leaving his office on a Saturday, which he had not done in 11 years of practice. The first person to approach Lena directly was the gray-whiskered man from Patton's Diner, the one who had told her not to get her hopes set too high. She was at the counter one morning in early December ordering coffee, and he was on his usual stool at the far end, and he waited until Donna had moved away before he spoke. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has revised a position he held with confidence and is not entirely comfortable with the revision, but has the integrity to make it anyway. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made an assumption about that property based on what I could see from a road, which is generally a poor basis for assumptions." He picked up his mug. "I'm sorry for that." Lena looked at him. He was a large man who worked outdoors and had not had an easy life, and was making himself say something difficult, which required its own form of courage. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." He nodded, finished his coffee, and that was the end of it. No dramatics, no extended scene. Just a man correcting himself and a girl accepting the correction in a diner on a mountain road in November. Two people being decent to each other in the specific, unspectacular way that decency usually actually happened. Donna, who had heard all of it from behind the counter, refilled Lena's coffee without comment and left the pot closer to her side than she normally would have. It was the Dunore equivalent of a standing ovation. Grace, when Lena told her the confirmed figure, sat in her kitchen with both hands wrapped around her mug for a very long time. The cats occupied their usual surfaces. The clock on the kitchen wall moved its hands around, in the way kitchen clocks always did, indifferent to the magnitude of any moment they were asked to mark. "Walter Callaway," Grace said finally. 40 years. Nobody ever—" She stopped. "He sat up on that road for 40 years, and nobody ever understood what he was doing up there." She looked at Lena. "He was the strangest man. Came to town maybe once a month for supplies. Never talked about himself. People thought he was hiding from something. Some people thought less of him than that." She set down her mug. "He was hiding something, I suppose. He just wasn't hiding from something. There's a difference, and most people never trouble themselves to consider it." "Did he ever mention a granddaughter?" Lena asked. "Or a grandchild?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Once. I was maybe 35, so that would have been the late 70s, before your mother left. He came in for coffee. He did that occasionally, just for the coffee. Never stayed long. And he said something I always remembered, but never fully understood. He said, 'The things worth building take longer than a lifetime. You just have to trust someone will show up to finish them.'" She looked at Lena. "I thought he was talking about the property. The stone building he was always working on up there. I asked him what he was building, and he said something that I thought was strange at the time." She paused. "He said, 'A door that opens the right way for the right person.' And then he paid for his coffee and left." Lena sat with that for a moment. A door that opens the right way for the right person. A man who had spent 31 years learning to see what other people missed, who had spent the rest of his life building a room for someone he would never meet, trusting that she would have enough of whatever he had. The patience, the willingness to look carefully, the refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what something was worth, to walk through it when she arrived. She thought he had been right to trust that. She thought, for the first time without guilt, that she was allowed to believe she had earned that trust. Dale's attorney called Ellis on a Tuesday in early December, and the call lasted 4 minutes, which Ellis reported to Lena afterward, with the understated satisfaction of a man who had practiced restraint long enough that small victories registered as clearly as large ones. "They're withdrawing," he said, "formally and without condition. The argument about marital property was always weak, and once his attorney reviewed the actual documentation your mother had prepared, it became untenable. The trust structure she established explicitly excluded the Callaway inheritance from the marital estate. It was done correctly, by a lawyer who knew what they were doing, which means your mother had help at some point, probably years before she got sick. Probably from someone who knew the situation and wanted to make sure it was handled properly." He paused. "I wish I'd known her." "She was very careful about things that mattered," Lena said. "She could seem careless because she let a lot of things go. But what she decided mattered. She handled completely." "That quality," Ellis said, "is rarer than people think." Dale did not call after the withdrawal. He did not write. Whatever calculation he had driven 6 hours to make in Patton's diner had resolved itself in the direction of cutting losses, which Lena suspected had always been available to him as an option, and had simply required his attorney's professional assessment to make it feel like the reasonable choice rather than the defeated one. She felt no triumph about this. She felt, if anything, a kind of tired relief, so the specific lightness that came when a thing you had been bracing for finally resolved and left you free to put your weight somewhere else. She put her weight into the farmhouse. The geological assessment of the Eastern Ridge mineral rights took 6 weeks and involved a firm from Pittsburgh that Ellis had located through a contact at the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources. 2 geologists spent 4 days on the ridge with equipment that Lena watched from the tree line without fully understanding what it was doing. And they produced a report 60 pages long that she read with the same careful attention she had given to every document in her grandfather's collection, looking for the words she could understand and using them to anchor the ones she couldn't. The words she could understand were sufficient. The natural gas deposits beneath the Eastern Ridge were confirmed as substantial, a formation that the 1981 Geological Survey had identified correctly, and that 40 years of advancing extraction technology had made commercially viable in ways that Walter Callaway had only been able to anticipate and not fully measure. A leasing offer arrived before the assessment report had been formally delivered, from an energy company that had apparently been watching the county records for exactly this kind of mineral rights clarification, made through a subsidiary in a way that was designed to obscure who was actually asking, and therefore how interested they actually were. Ellis identified the parent company in 45 minutes of research. He called their actual legal department directly and informed them that his client was aware of the asset's value and would be taking competitive bids. The subsidiary's offer, which had been structured to sound generous, while being approximately a third of what the rights were worth, was not acknowledged. By February, 3 companies had submitted formal bids. The highest, for a 50-year lease with royalty provisions that increased at regular intervals and returned the rights to Lena's estate at the end of the term, came to an upfront payment of $18 million and projected royalties, conservatively estimated, of an additional $40 million across the lease period. Lena sat in Ellis's office in Marlinton. Right across the desk from him and Catherine Marsh and the Pittsburgh geologist and an attorney who had driven from Charleston to review the lease terms, and she thought about a man writing by hand in a stone building in 1984, his hands going slower than they used to, adding a supplement to a letter he had already sealed because he wanted to be complete, because he had promised himself he would leave nothing out that she might need. I do not know what to make of those findings, and by the time you read this, perhaps you will know more than I did. She knew more than he did. The world had caught up to what he had seen in 1984, the way the world eventually always caught up to what people with clear eyes saw early. She signed the lease documents with hands that were perfectly steady, because she had been practicing steadiness for a long time, and the practice had been sufficient. The collection went to auction in 3 stages over 18 months, managed by Catherine Marsh's firm in partnership with Christie's European Clocks and Watches Department, with the Smithsonian acquiring 4 significant pieces outright at negotiated prices for their permanent collection. The Tompions sold in London to a private collector for $4.3 million. The Breguet sold in Geneva for $38 million, becoming the highest price ever paid at auction for a pocket watch, a record that held for 11 months before being broken by a different watch entirely, which did nothing to diminish what the moment had been. The remaining collection had sold across the 2 additional auction sessions and through a curated private sale managed by Catherine for collectors, who preferred not to bid publicly, achieved a total that landed within Catherine's projected range, $107 million across the full portfolio, net of fees and taxes and the considerable costs of the authentication and auction process itself. $107 million. The life's work of a private, difficult, precise man who had learned to see value in things other people walked past, applied across 31 years to a collection built in secret on a mountain road, locked behind a door designed for 1 key, addressed to a name he didn't yet know. Lena did not allow herself to fully absorb the number all at once, because she had learned from watching the people around her that the full weight of a number like that, absorbed all at once, had a way of making people into different versions of themselves than they intended to become. She absorbed it in pieces, the way you read a very long letter, 1 paragraph at a time, giving each section its proper attention before moving to the next. The first piece she absorbed. She would never again have to calculate what she could afford to eat. The second, she would finish high school. She enrolled in the regional high school in Marlinton, which required arrangements that Ellis helped her navigate as an emancipated minor, and she drove the 20 miles each way in the used truck she bought from a man in Dunore for a price that was fair to both of them. She was not a spectacular student in the way she might have been if the previous years had gone differently, but she was precise and thorough and willing to sit with difficult material until it yielded, which were exactly the qualities that mattered in the end. She graduated the following June in the gymnasium of a school where she had been a student for 7 months, and Grace and Ellis sat in the folding chairs arranged on the gymnasium floor, and nobody from her previous life came, and that was all right. The third piece, the farmhouse. She hired a local contractor recommended by Frank Morrison, who ran the hardware store in Dunmore and had known her grandfather distantly and spoke of him with the particular respect reserved for people who had been misunderstood in ways that were only clarified by the passage of time. The restoration took 8 months and was done correctly. The roof replaced, the windows restored where possible and replaced where they couldn't be, the porch rebuilt to match the original, the floors repaired and refinished, the kitchen made functional without erasing the evidence of what it had been. The cook stove was cleaned and serviced and remained where it had always stood. The coat hook on the bedroom door remained where her grandfather had fixed it decades ago, though the coat that had hung on it was gone. She left the hook bare. Some absences deserved to remain visible. She moved into the farmhouse in April of the following year. Her first night alone in it, she sat by the window of the living room in the wooden chair her grandfather had positioned there before she was born. And she looked out at the dark yard and the dark tree line and the dark mountains beyond. And she listened to the creek she could now locate precisely. 20 yards into the trees to the east, running south along the property boundary over a bed of smooth, flat stones that she had stood on twice now and found to be exactly as cold and clear as the sound of them suggested. The house was warm, the stove worked. Outside, the stone building stood at the back of the property behind its locked door, emptied now of the clocks her grandfather had spent his life assembling, but not empty. The space inside it was still his. The workbench remained, and the labeled drawers with their spare parts, and the tools he had used for 31 years and transported up this mountain road and arranged on their hooks and pegs with the precision of someone who intended to keep working. She had not decided yet what to do with the space. She was in no hurry to decide. She found her grandfather's grave in the Dunmore Cemetery in March, 6 months after she had moved into the farmhouse, which was later than she should have looked, and she knew it. But some things required a particular readiness that could not be manufactured before it arrived naturally. The headstone was simple field stone, the same material as the building he had constructed on Hollow Creek Road, and she thought that was either a coincidence or the most precisely accurate thing about him that remained in the world. His name was carved into it without flourish: Walter James Callaway, 1931 to 1984. Below the name, no verse, no epitaph, nothing additional. A man who had communicated through his work rather than through words, faithful to that preference, even in what would be read about him after he was gone. She stood at the grave for a long time in the cold March air, the same cold that had been waiting for her when she stepped off the bus in Marlinton the previous November with $43 and a key and a life that had just collapsed into something she had not yet understood was an opening rather than an ending. She did not have a speech prepared. She did not believe he would have wanted a speech, and she found she agreed with him. She only stood there for a while, in the particular silence of a cemetery in early spring when the snow was gone and the ground was softening and the birds were beginning to return to the bare trees. And she let what was true be true, without trying to arrange it into anything more organized than that. What was true was this. A man she had never met had spent his entire life building something for her. He had not known her name or her face or the shape of her life or what she would need when she arrived. He had only known that she would come, and that what he had built would be sufficient for whatever she arrived with, and he had been right. Not because he had been lucky, or because the world had bent to accommodate his intentions, but because he had built carefully and completely and without shortcuts, and because the woman he had failed as a father had done the one thing he had asked of her, and kept the key and passed it on. She thought about her mother, Eleanor, who had been Ellie, who had laughed with her head thrown back at a farmer's market on a Sunday afternoon and been photographed in that moment by her daughter, who had not known yet that she was creating the document that would matter most. Eleanor, who had paid 40 years of property taxes on a property she could not visit, who had carried a key through every difficult year without letting go of it, who had pressed it into her daughter's hand in a hospital room and said, "Don't let Dale tell you differently," with the fierce certainty of a woman who had made sure in advance that Dale couldn't. Her mother had known, not the details, not the collection, not the mineral rights, not the figure that would eventually resolve into something that felt more like a life's worth of deferred justice than a number. But she had known that there was something at the end of Hollow Creek Road worth protecting, worth carrying, worth passing on to whoever her daughter turned out to be, because she had believed in her daughter's capacity to be the right person for whatever was on the other side of that door. She had made herself the bridge between a father who gave his best attention to objects and a daughter who would inherit the result of that attention, spanning the gap between them with 40 years of automatic tax payments and a key kept in a soft envelope and a set of legal documents drawn up at the right time with the right attention to detail. The love in that was not the simple kind. It was the complicated, imperfect, a quietly heroic kind, the kind that showed itself through paperwork and foresight and the stubborn refusal to let go of something that might matter to someone who didn't exist yet, the kind that did not announce itself or require acknowledgement or leave a record of its own presence because it was entirely invested in what it made possible, rather than in being seen to make it possible. Lena thought she understood now, for the first time without reservation, what she had been given. Not the money, not the collection, not the mineral rights, not the stone building or the farmhouse or the 12 acres on Hollow Creek Road. She had been given a chain, her grandfather's precision passed to her mother's patience, passed to her own willingness to walk 3 miles down a mountain road toward something she had been told was probably worthless. 3 people who had seen what was actually there rather than what was easy to see, connecting across decades through a single brass key and the shared conviction that some things were worth waiting for and some doors were worth opening even when you didn't know what was on the other side. She stood at her grandfather's headstone until the cold moved through her coat and made her feet go numb, which was long enough. Then she walked back through the cemetery and out the iron gate, and got into her truck and drove back up Hollow Creek Road through the bare March trees. and when the property came into view around the final curve of the drive, she stopped the truck and looked at it for a moment. The farmhouse with its new roof and its lit windows. The stone building at the back of the lot behind its locked door. The creek voice coming through the trees. The mountains closing everything in with the patient permanence of old things that had never needed to announce themselves. It was hers. Earned in the only way things were genuinely earned. Not by deserving it in the abstract, but by showing up and paying attention and being willing to walk toward difficult things rather than away from them, and trusting that the key she had been given fit the lock that had been built for it. She drove the rest of the way up the drive and parked and went inside, and the house was warm from the stove she had left banked that morning, and the room smelled of wood smoke and the particular living smell of a house that had someone in it, again after too long without. She made coffee in the kitchen, where the old tin pot still stood on the shelf because she had decided to leave it there, and she stood at the window, where her grandfather must have stood thousands of times, and looked out at the bare yard and the trees and the mountains beyond. She thought about what she wanted to build, not the house, which was already built, not the collection, which had already been built and dispersed into the world to be cared for by people who understood it. Something else. Something that would take longer than felt comfortable and require more patience than she was certain she had, and benefit someone she couldn't yet picture, because that was the kind of building that was worth the effort. And she was, after all, not precisely the granddaughter of a man who had spent his whole life learning that lesson and trusted her to carry it forward. She had $43 and a key, and now she had everything. And she understood, holding her coffee in the kitchen of her grandfather's house on a cold March morning with the creek running outside and the mountains standing where they had always stood, that what you arrived with was never the point. The point was always what you were willing to open. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.